January 2017. That was the start of my home theater YouTube journey. The idea was to review audio and video gear and document my upgrades as I progressed on upwards, but it slowly morphed into not only AV equipment, but actually reviewing movies on the newest Blu-ray format, which we now know as 4K Blu-ray. It's got the best audio and video quality to ever grace our eyes and ears. And when I started doing these movie reviews, yeah, there was a couple folks talking about how good or bad the video quality was on these Blu-rays, but nobody was talking about the audio quality. So I figured since I had a pretty decent setup already, well, a pretty decent audio setup, I could talk about the newest format, which was Dolby Atmos and DTS:X. But as the months and the years went by, my amplifiers and processors got better and better, I finally got to a place where I didn't think there was really any place else to go. The only thing left for me to keep searching for was the perfect speakers. I started with M&Ks, went to Rendell Sound, Bowers & Wilkins, Martin Logan, Focal, and most recently Perlisten. I'm sure there's others that I'm missing, but those are the ones that really stood out. As a side note, I review a lot of products, especially speakers. When I'm done, I send the speakers back, or whatever it is I'm reviewing, they all get sent back, so I don't get to keep the stuff. I know a lot of people get confused about how it works. If there's something that I really like, I'll either take my time with the review so I don't have to give it back so soon, Focal Utopia, or I can just buy it because I really like it. This is one of the perks about reviewing all this stuff, is that I get to play with so many great products and test them out, which in turn, I share the experience with you guys. Now, some of those speakers that I mentioned I would consider quote-unquote endgame level speakers, but the thing is, with say the Rendell and the Perlistens, those are really big speakers that take up a lot of floor space that I'm not willing to give up. If I had a bigger room, then sure, I'd probably actually own one of those setups, but I don't, so my search went from getting some really badass speakers to ones that I can hang on my wall that would disappear in my room and just stay out of the way. Which brought me to Dolly, PSB, Martin Logan, XTZ, and Procella. Again, those were all great speakers, but there was just something missing. Now I've got these Ascendo speakers. The one thing that I loved about the B&W and Dolly setups was that they were all identical speakers. That means they were perfectly timbre matched because they were exactly the same, so they sound exactly the same. Not just the same tweeter and the same woofer, but also the same enclosure. Having speakers that sound the same is important for surround sound because you don't want a Ferrari to sound like a Ferrari in the front speakers only to drive off in the back speakers and sound like a go-kart. Which brings us to the Ascendo Immersive Audio, the 6s. I've got 8 of these. I've got left, center, right surround, left, right surround back, and then center surround back, which is this guy. Now for the height channels and the wide channels, these are not exactly the same, although they use the exact same 6.5-inch coaxial driver, which has a frequency response of 80 Hz to 20K. But one is a flat-on wall, while this other one is in a wedge shape, which also comes with a wall bracket, so you can aim it directly at the seats. They both have a sensitivity of 93 dB, which will make them super easy to drive with most AVRs, so they can play up to peaks of 117 dB. Now, since I've kind of ruled out having stand mount speakers in my home theater and opting for these on walls, not only have I gained a lot of extra floor space, but I'm able to mount the LCR channels behind the screen. Obviously, if you've got a television set, you can't do that, but placing these behind my Stewart Filmscreen Harmony G2, the dialogue sounds like it's coming directly from the actors' mouths rather than below the screen. And having the left and right channels behind the screen keeps the effects within the screen's boundaries, rather than placing them too far off to the left or the right sides, which could potentially make the front soundstage too wide. And because the speakers measure only 3.5 inches deep, you don't need a ton of space behind your screen. I was even able to hide my side surround channels in my acoustic panels, which are 2 inches thick. All I did was cut a hole inside the panel itself and slide the panel right over the speaker. You can see here that the magnetic grill still attaches to it. This not only keeps it nice and clean and hides the speaker, keeps it out of the way, but also helps out with the SBIR effect, which is speaker boundary interference response. For the back speakers, I didn't hide these in any panels, but I did purchase these VESA wall mounts. This will let you tilt and swivel the speakers towards your listening position. These wall mounts do not come, actually no wall mounts come with these speakers, but if you do want to purchase them, you have to make sure they are VESA 100 compliant mounts. I'll leave a link in this video's description if you want to pick up the same ones. They go for something like 20 or 30 bucks. In total, I've got 14 channels plus 2 Ascendo SV12 subwoofers. I've got everything hooked up to a Trinov Altitude processor, and the speakers are powered by a pair of Trinov Amplitude 8M amplifiers. Also in the rack, I've got a Kaleidoscape and a Zapiti media player, which I use for watching content and playing demos. Now, none of these speakers, the Wedges or the standard flat ones, have any real usable bass output. They're spec'd at 80 Hz, but they need to be crossed over at like 100, so you will 100% need to use a subwoofer. One of the best movies to test out how well matched your speakers are is the ATMOS version of Gravity, if you can find it. It's available on Blu-ray, or if you have the Kaleidoscape, it's available on the Kaleidoscape as well. The scene at the start of the movie has this conversation with Clooney and Sandra Bullock and that guy from The Rock.
This is Brigadier General Francis X. Hummel, United States Marine Corps, from Alcatraz. Out.
They've got this dialogue that circulates through every single one of your speakers. As the characters float around the scene and the camera pans, you'll hear the characters talking through various speakers and slowly drift around through all the different channels.
Like a chihuahua that's being tumble drive?
Well, it's been a rough week. If it makes you feel any better, I coughed up everything but my kidneys on my first ride.
Shit. Like a chihuahua that's being tumble drive?
Well, it's been a rough week. If it makes you feel any better, I coughed up everything but my kidneys on my first ride.
Shit.
Having the height channels being a totally different shape than the other channels, I was worried that I was going to hear a difference when the voices would move between the two. But since these are really limited in bass response, I didn't hear really that much of a difference. Now, I ran the demo full range without any subwoofers, and I felt the standard speakers, the flat ones, had a very small amount more bass than the Wedges. So Clooney's voice was, I'd say, a touch deeper. If I wasn't trying to listen for it, then I doubt that I'd hear it. With the speakers crossed at 100 Hz with subwoofers, then they sounded identical to my ears. I'd say the main takeaway with this demo is how clean and precise these coaxial drivers are. You know, I've probably watched this clip 100 times or more on different speakers. With these, they're so detailed, it sounded like the voices were floating over my shoulder rather than coming from the back corner. And because they all sound the same, when the voices were drifting through different channels, I didn't notice any gaps between the channels or changes in tonal clarity. Certain speakers might lean more on the mid-range or have softer treble response, which can make things smeared if things are moving behind your head and also make them less directional. Not the case with these, they're pinpoint accurate. When Houston's talking in the top right speaker then moves over to the back left, it's distinctly directional, which makes hearing these effects very easy to follow.
Chain reaction, hitting other satellites and creating new debris. Traveling faster than a high-speed bullet up to your altitude. How copy? Copy all.
Now for something a bit more dynamic, I watched Midway, which has a very aggressive ATMOS mix. There's planes that traverse the entire soundstage and puts aggressive use of all the available speakers.
Get the wounded below deck! Everyone else battle stations!
Okay, so there's really no reason to ever run these speakers full range without subwoofers. They're just not going to sound right. But with capable subwoofers, the speakers are truly dynamic. With these kinds of big blockbuster audio mixes, you just can't help but keep wanting to keep cranking the volume up. And at loud levels, I've never felt that the soundstage collapses in a sea of overdriven harshness. And that's because the 1-inch soft dome tweeter, while I don't think is as airy as a beryllium tweeter, has just the right amount of crispiness to the top end without getting overly sharp if things are getting too loud. So there's a touch of warmth and smoothness in the treble. And because the coaxials have that clean directivity, it made it easy to hear the distance between which plane was coming from the front wide channel and the one coming from the top left. So working in tandem with a good processor, the speakers came across impressively accurate. You want to hear the weight difference between the plane that just flew overhead to the one that's coming behind it, which should sound lighter. There's planes, explosions, machine guns, flames, and people all talking and congealing in this surround extravaganza. The Ascendos were able to keep all these different effects from turning into one massive noise orgy. So everything had their own distinctive space and air around them, which just heightens the three-dimensional separation and immersiveness that we all want from these ATMOS mixes. With Gravity, you've got a mix which brings the characters right up to us having conversations in close proximity, and even putting us in the character's helmet in a first-person point of view. In midway, you've got this huge open-air battle with heavy hitting effects bombarding your senses in every direction. And then in a quiet place, we've got this calm, serene, atmospheric soundscape. So going back to the Ascendos having this accurate presentation, if the mix is intimate or chaotic or just dialogue driven, they're able to keep what you're hearing perfectly matched up to what you're seeing on screen. You know, I've heard speakers that can have this immense, huge, three-dimensional soundstage, which makes everything sound massive. And don't get me wrong, they sound phenomenal, but they're just adding a different flavor to what you're seeing on screen. If you're watching a sitcom, you don't want it to sound like it's happening at a concert hall. With the Ascendos, they've truly captured this outdoor environment and all the tiny subtleties that they put in the mix. I'm hearing insects over my shoulder, the wind blowing above my head, and some trees blowing someplace across the street. So if the mix calls for it, once the lights go off, your walls will disappear and you'll be thrown into whatever is happening on screen. Now, not only do I have the 6s, but I've also got 3 of the 10s on hand, which I swapped out for the LCRs. And when comparing the two, the main difference is that yes, the driver is bigger and the enclosure is bigger, so in my mind, I figured that there would be a massive difference in bass, but it was surprisingly minimal at best, and this was running them at full range. Remember, the 6s are rated down to 80 Hz while the 10s are rated to go down to 75 Hz. The 10s will play louder, so if you've got a really big room, then the 10s are going to be better for your space. They'll peak at 123 dB, whereas the 6s will peak at 117 dB. But in my room, after crossing them at 100 Hz, they sounded almost exactly the same, which is great because if you're going to mix and match different sizes for whatever reason, you'll know that at least in these 3 particular models, they will share the exact same tonal character.
First order was just the beginning. I will give you so much more. First order was just the beginning. I will give you so much more. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be.
The Ascendos pretty much hit all the right spots for my home theater. They're small and shallow, so they're easy to mount and they stay out of the way. They're one of the most detailed speakers that I've heard, with great dynamic range for huge action or just an atmospheric horror flick. And they're not insanely expensive. The 6 Wedge is $1,340, while the regular 6 is $1,300. If you want to step up to the 10s, that's selling for $2,200 each. Now those are the prices at the time of this video. Can you get bigger speakers that can play louder or have more bass? Sure, you can. But these particular models in this particular form factor with this level of sound quality fits my particular requirements, and I'm sure a lot of you guys watching this video as well. So for that, I think that these are reasonably priced. Now, of course, they're not perfect. I do wish they had a bit more bass so I can cross them over lower, but I do understand the 3-tiered philosophy. Speakers, subs for kick bass, and then another sub for the infrasonics. I heard this setup when I went to the theater in Germany, which I thought was amazing. So when I got the chance to try out the same setup here in my house, albeit in a much smaller scale, it was a no-brainer. Although I've only got 2 tiers, the speakers and the 12-inchers, I haven't tried out their infrasonic subs yet, but we're working on it. And one thing that truly does bother me about these speakers, not a deal breaker though, is that they use Phoenix connections rather than binding posts. So if you've got 14 gauge cable or larger, it's a massive hassle to shave down the cable to fit these little tiny openings. The next speakers that I've got in for review, I'm gonna have to disconnect at the amplifier and run temporary cables to all the new speakers. So coming from someone who reviews speakers for a living, it's a huge inconvenience. But hey, if these are gonna be your endgame speakers, you'll mount them on your wall and then you'll probably never have to disconnect them ever again. Unless, of course, they come out with something better. At the end of the day, these speakers definitely do it for me. I wouldn't say my search is over for the perfect speakers for this room, but as of right now, I do think that these are that good where I can say that they're gonna stick around for the time being. Unless, of course, they come out with a better model. If you want any additional info on these speakers, I'll leave some links down below in this video's description. Thanks for watching, like this video if you found it useful, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.